I want to welcome everybody to this public opportunity to comment on the draft environmental impact report for the project titled "The Potential Acquisition of Monterey Water System and District Boundary Adjustment." Most of the heavy lifting tonight will be done by Megan Jones with Rincon Associates, or Rincon Consultants rather. She'll tell you the ground rules and how we're going to provide public comment and what the timeline is. I should tell you that we're basically pretty close to right in the middle of our 45-day comment period. So public comment is going to be accepted all the way through, I believe it's August 3rd. And that will be the close, at which time the comments will be addressed and a final EIR will be turned around for board certification in mid-September. So with that, I just want to let you know the two parts of this, and Megan can touch on it again. The public initiative from November of 2018 called Measure J opened the door that if economically feasible, the district should examine acquisition of the privately owned water system, which in our case is California American Water, and inside our jurisdiction, which would be the Cal-Am main system, the Ryan Ranch, Bishop, and Hidden Hills. So this effort reviews the environmental impacts of that acquisition. And in so doing, we've discovered a little over 50 parcels representing about 43 connections, which in order to continue to serve and make part of the any new system would need to be annexed into our system. And so that's the other component element of this. And with that, I want to turn it over to Megan Jones, the project manager from Rincon Consultants.
Thanks, Dave. And just for a few other introductions, also on today's meeting from Rincon, we have Jennifer Haddow, who's the principal in charge of the EIR, and Ashley Quackenbush, the assistant project manager. We also have David Laredo, general counsel for the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District. So I will be doing the presentation before opening it up for public comment. I'll have a very brief introduction, do a quick overview of the project. Many of you joining this meeting are probably familiar with it, but for those who are not, I'm going to provide a little background on the project as well as the environmental review process that we are going through right now, and then jump into the bulk of the presentation, which will be a summary of the analysis in the draft EIR for those who have not already read it cover to cover. And then we'll open it up for public comments, and I'll explain at the end how that is going to work through this Zoom platform, as well as other ways to provide comment before the deadline. So real quickly, as a sort of introduction and project overview, the project is the potential acquisition of the Monterey Water System, or MWS. It's shown on this image here. It's currently owned by California American Water, or Cal-Am. It's approximately 55 square miles in size with about 40,000 current connections. It includes the main system as well as Bishop, Hidden Hills, and Ryan Ranch. It's important to note, and Dave mentioned this, that it does not include the central satellites of Ralph Lane, Ambler, Toro, Chular, and Garrapatta. So important to note that. That will come up later in the presentation as well. It does include two areas that are not currently within the district service boundary, and those are shown on this image. For those who have a good sized screen in front of them, it's the about 33 residential connections at Yankee Point to the south there, and then about 10 residential connections in Hidden Hills. So that those areas would be annexed to the district as part of this project. The project is really being carried out in response to Measure J. And again, many of you are probably familiar with this, but for those who are not, this was a ballot initiative passed by Monterey Peninsula voters in November 2018. And it essentially added Rule 19.8, instructing the district to undertake a feasibility study on the public takeover of Cal-Am's Monterey Water System. The district held a series of listening sessions to receive input on the enactment of this rule. That was in January of 2019. In August of 2019, they released a plan to pursue the public ownership. And then in October 2019, released a feasibility study, a preliminary evaluation and cost of service analysis report, followed by a workshop on the feasibility study in November 2019, whereby the district received public input on that information. The environmental review process that we're working on now is part of the next phase of this potential acquisition. The reason for doing this project is really because of Measure J. The underlying purpose is for the district to acquire, operate, and maintain the MWS. And this does include planned but not yet constructed facilities. So to be clear, it does include the Monterey Water Supply Project desalination facility, although the construction and operation of that is the subject of a separate environmental analysis, but the acquisition would include that facility if it's constructed at that time. Ultimately, the objectives are all related to Measure J, as I mentioned, which were, of course, dictated by the voters. Several of the key provisions within Measure J are to allow the citizens of the Monterey Peninsula to independently own and operate the water production and distribution system currently served by Cal-Am, providing greater transparency and accountability, enhanced customer service, providing greater local control over the rate setting process, providing direct access to locally elected policymakers. Again, all of these are outlined in Measure J and are identified in the EIR as objectives of the proposed project. So now I will shift gears to discuss the environmental review process generally before I dive into a summary of where we're at this point. So the reason we're doing this is to comply with the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. If you joined, I should mention, if you participated in the scoping meeting, some of these slides are a little bit repetitive, so I apologize for that, but we want to make sure that everybody has the same information and background before we dive into the details. But the California Environmental Quality Act was really intended to inform decision-making and disclose potentially significant environmental impacts. Before this law was enacted, decision-makers didn't have to consider environmental impacts of projects that they might approve. CEQA goes a step further to also attempt to identify ways to avoid or reduce environmental impacts. This is through what we call mitigation measures. We also look at alternatives to a proposed project that, again, are intended to reduce or eliminate significant environmental effects. And then last but not least, a key purpose of CEQA is to foster public participation as well as interagency coordination. And we do that through various public review periods like we're in now in these public meetings. This is another slide that just shows us essentially a diagram of the process. We showed this last time. The boxes on the left in blue are essentially the steps in the process. The boxes on the right in green are the opportunities for public input. At the scoping meeting early in the process, we were at the first green box. Now we're at the second green box. So we have now released a draft environmental impact report for public review. That's a mandatory 45-day public review period, which started on June 18th. So the end of that comment period is August 3rd. After the comment period closes, CEQA requires that we respond to each and every public comment in writing. So we do that in a responses to comments that sometimes results in revisions to the analysis or the documentation. Those revisions get folded in, and that becomes the final EIR that goes to decision makers for consideration. At that point, we also prepare findings and, if applicable, a statement of overriding considerations. And then once a decision is made on the project, we file a notice of determination. So now I will get into summarizing the draft EIR. So for those not as familiar with CEQA, this is essentially all of the CEQA issue areas that we look at. There's 18 of them. It's pretty all-inclusive. All of these issues are addressed in EIR. However, as I'll get to in a couple of slides, we focus a little more heavily on 6 of them. The rest are addressed in an effects found not to be significant section of the document. It's also helpful to have a little bit of background and understanding on some of the terminology that we use. So in CEQA, we identify impacts compared to significance thresholds. These thresholds are based on the CEQA guidelines and regulations and other measures put out by the air district or other entities. So, and then we identify mitigation measures to avoid or reduce impacts to below the threshold. So this diagram on the right is helpful for people who aren't familiar with this. We compare impacts to baseline conditions, which is typically just current conditions, what's on the ground now. We then measure the impact between existing conditions to the significance threshold. If it's under that threshold or that dotted line in the diagram, that's a less than significant impact. If it's over the threshold, it's considered a significant impact, and we identify mitigation measures to try to reduce it back below that dotted line. If we're successful in that, that impact is called less than significant with mitigation. If there's no mitigation available or not enough mitigation to bring an impact below that threshold, that impact is identified as significant and unavoidable. So for a quick high-level summary, and if you just want sort of a snapshot of the impacts identified in the EIR, a good place to go is the executive summary, which has a table in it that essentially shows a summary of each impact, any mitigation measures that are required, and then the residual impact or where it lies, less than significant with mitigation, et cetera. So that's a good place, but if you want a little more detail on how that was determined, what went into that analysis, you should definitely look at the full chapters of the EIR. But in a snapshot perspective, there were a total of 12 impacts identified. 10 of those were less than significant, so they didn't achieve or didn't go over that threshold of that dotted line. 2 of them were less than significant with mitigation, and 0 were considered significant and unavoidable. So the 2 impacts that exceeded thresholds, we were able to mitigate below that threshold. So the issues that we analyzed in detail in the EIR, there were 6 kind of key chapters. This included air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, hydrology and water quality, noise, transportation, and utilities and service systems. These impacts can really be described in sort of 2 camps, those related to vehicle miles traveled or VMT, and those related to water demand. So I'll describe both of these in turn. So on the vehicle miles traveled or VMT, we considered how operation of the system by the district could be different from current conditions or the baseline. As I mentioned in the summary of the project, there's no construction, there's no new facilities, so there's no construction trips. And because there's no new facilities, they wouldn't generate new trips, but the project does exclude some of CalAM's satellite systems, as we mentioned, which CalAM would continue to own and operate and service. So there would be vehicle trips still required for operations and maintenance of those satellite systems. So the analysis in the EIR makes several conservative assumptions on where trips would originate from, how far they would be needed, and ultimately found that there would be a duplication of trips as a result of district employees servicing the main moderate water system and CalAM employees servicing the central satellite. And I do see a notice here that someone has raised their hand. When we get to the end of the presentation, I'll describe the way to provide public comment. We also looked at whether there would be new employees. And so based on some of the analysis the district has done to date, the district plans to offer employment to approximately 77 of the 81 existing CalAM staff, and then would add approximately 10 additional positions in district administration related to billing, finance, and customer service. So in total, there would be approximately 87 employees hired by the district associated with Monterey Water System, which would be a net increase of 6 employees compared to existing conditions. So that's 6 net new employees. In addition, the analysis conservatively assumed that CalAM would have to hire approximately 6 additional employees on top of that to continue to operate and maintain the central satellite. So as a result, the analysis assumed that the project would result in a net increase of 12 employees, 6 at the district and 6 with CalAM. We then looked at this potential increase in vehicle miles traveled or the duplication of trips, as well as the increase in employees, and ran an air quality model to get the air quality and greenhouse gas emissions, and found that greenhouse gas emissions would increase by about 62.7 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Now, the threshold we used in this analysis of the dotted line was net 0. So any increase in emissions would be considered a potentially significant impact. This is a very conservative threshold. You really can't get lower than 0. Because emissions would be higher than 0, the EIR identifies a mitigation measure, which is mitigation measure GHG-1, which requires preparation and implementation of a greenhouse gas reduction plan. The measure includes a variety of options for reducing emissions, from telecommuting to electric vehicles to tree planting or carbon offsets. So the EIR outlines multiple scenarios for achieving a reduction of 62.7 metric tons of CO2 equivalent to get to 0. So this shows that the mitigation is feasible with different types of scenarios of that mitigation, and as such, the impact is considered less than significant with mitigation. So also related to the VMT issue is, of course, air quality, noise, and transportation. We looked at all of those impacts as well. There would be some increases in emissions as a result of everything I described on the previous slide. However, the thresholds for air quality emissions are not zero, they're a bit higher. So those impacts were found to be less than significant, as were increases related to roadway noise or transportation impacts. So ultimately, these would be incremental or a small increase and would be less than significant. So the other key issue we analyzed, the two chapters in the environmental document are hydrology, water quality, and utilities, with the key issue in both of them really being water supply. So we looked at, if water rates were to decrease under district ownership, would the reduced cost to customers potentially increase water usage? So we utilized some published research on the correlation between water usage or conservation and water rates to estimate the potential for water usage to increase. However, the district would be required to comply with multiple existing regulations related to water supply. This includes the Seaside Groundwater Basin Adjudication Decision, State Water Resources Control Board Order, as well as water use reduction strategies and goals contained in the 2018 water conservation legislation and the California Water Conservation Act of 2009, all of which are described in EIR. All of these regulations ultimately place an upper limit on the pumping out of the groundwater, the Seaside Groundwater Basin, as well as withdrawals from the Carmel River. So because of those limits, ultimately, even if rates decreased so much that people would increase their demand, they would not be able to increase demand beyond those limits. So those impacts were identified also as less than significant. We also looked at growth inducement, or the potential for the project to foster economic or population growth, including through removing an obstacle to growth. So a classic example of this is constructing a new roadway or other infrastructure utilities, out into the middle of nowhere that now allows that area to be developed. So that would be considered growth inducing. As I've described in the previous slides, the project really, would not result in any direct economic or growth inducing impacts, as it would not include new facilities, wouldn't significantly change operation, and would not change the number of customers served by the system. It could actually result in a beneficial economic impact due to the cost savings and customers being able to spend that money in other ways within the local economy. As I mentioned, the project would result in an increase in approximately 12 employees hired by either the district or CalAM. It is assumed that these employees would likely be hired from within the local employment pool. However, even if they were from outside the area and relocated for the jobs, 12 employees does not constitute a substantial population increase in the area. We also looked at annexation and determined that that would not remove an obstacle to growth, because the project itself does not allow new development. The district does not have land use authority. It's simply switching over who is providing the water service. Okay, and then lastly, we looked at alternatives. So CEQA does require that you look at alternatives, and as defined in CEQA, the intent of alternatives is really twofold. The first is to avoid or substantially lessen significant effects, and the second is to meet project objectives. As I noted in the summary, there were no significant and unavoidable environmental effects, just the two impacts related to greenhouse gas emissions that require mitigation. They both rely on the same mitigation measure, which makes it a little interesting to try and find alternatives, especially with the objectives of the project being really tied to implementing Measure J. So before I introduce the alternatives, I did want to mention one alternative that we considered but ultimately rejected from detailed consideration in the EIR, and that's an alternative whereby the district would acquire all assets, meaning wastewater in addition to water assets, and ultimately that was rejected because it would not meet project objectives, which are to implement Measure J. And as stated previously, this all relates to public ownership of the water system assets, not the wastewater system assets. So for that reason, that alternative was not considered in detail. We did look at 4 alternatives in detail. The first is required under CEQA. It's the no project alternative. So that's essentially nothing would happen. There would be no change. Alternative 2 was a no boundary adjustment alternative, where areas outside the district would not be annexed. As I mentioned, there's 2 small areas that within the project would be annexed. So this alternative assumes that that does not happen. The third alternative is a private third-party operator alternative, which essentially assumes that instead of the district operating the system, they would hire a contractor for those services. And then the fourth alternative was a combination of alternatives 2 and 3. So there would be no boundary adjustment, as well as private third-party operator of the system. So this table, which may be hard to read depending on your screen size, this is also in the EIR itself in the alternatives chapter. This is a summary of the alternatives analysis. So we go through each of the issue areas looked at in detail in the EIR, the proposed project impact classification, which you can see is less than significant for all issues except greenhouse gas emissions, and then we compare how the alternative lines up. In this particular table, equal is obviously it's the same level of impact. A plus sign means that it's environmentally better. So you'll see for the no project alternative, because nothing would happen, there would not be that increase in vehicle miles traveled or new employees. So any impacts related to air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, noise, and transportation would be eliminated. So since there were some impacts in those issue areas, that gets a plus sign. As you get into the remainder of the alternatives, you see that it's all equal signs. Despite the having no boundary adjustment or third-party contractor, ultimately operations would be essentially the same number of employees, all of those assumptions would remain. And so the environmental impacts are really equivalent. So CEQA does require that we identify the environmentally superior alternative. If that happens to be the no project alternative, we are required to identify the next environmentally superior. Now, in this case, based on the last slide, it's difficult to do so because there's no clear, winner beyond the no project. So we went with the other main aspect. I mentioned alternatives are intended to reduce environmental effects and also meet project objectives. So we looked at project objectives and which alternative most met the project objective to very narrowly select the private third-party operator alternative, or alternative 3, as environmentally superior. And again, this is really an exercise required by CEQA, but it's important to note that, again, there were no significant unavoidable impacts of the project, and this alternative would not improve or limit or reduce those environmental impacts identified for the project. So before we open it up for the public comments, I wanted to highlight the EIR timeline and kind of where we're at in the next steps. So I mentioned we're in this 45-day public comment period right now. That closes on August 3rd, 2020 at 5 p.m. So that is the deadline to submit written comments on the draft EIR. And although we will be taking comments here in just a minute and saving them for the record, we do encourage everyone to submit a formal record. And I'll explain how to do that and where to send comments on the next slide. Once we get all those comments, we will respond to everything in writing, prepare the final EIR. We anticipate that being available in the late August to September timeframe, and then that will go to hearing in September or October 2020. So now we will open it up for comment. A few points to make first before we do that. So we are looking for comments on the draft EIR analysis, which I've just summarized. So environmental issues, EIR adequacy. I'll explain how to do it through the chat function, and we will have a record of that, but we do again want to reiterate that, we would like for you to also submit written comments. The information is right here for where to send those, the email address and the mailing address if you submit a hard copy. And please be sure to do that by Monday, August 3rd at 5 p.m. For comments during this meeting, if you attended the scoping meeting, it's going to go pretty much the same. Within Zoom, there is a chat function. And if you go to it, there's the 3 dots in the corner, you go to chat. If you click that, you'll have a few different options. We ask that you message the meeting host, Rincon Consultants. You should see that in the drop-down options to send your comments in. And those will make their way to me and I will read them into the record. For security purposes, we don't want to unmute people or have people share their screens. I will read off the comment. We'll try not to get into too much Q&A because the intent is really just to receive the comments and provide the information to the public. So I'm sure it's going to take a minute for people to start sending those in, but go ahead and start doing that now.
And Megan, we
yes.
have 4 phone-in participants. Their option is simply written comments through the written comment process, correct?
Yes, and thank you for noting that. So for those just calling in or anybody watching on the public access, you're unfortunately not able to use the chat function, but please be sure to send in your written comments to the mailing address that is on the notice of availability. You can also get that, if you can't see the PowerPoint, you can get that on the district's website. But the email address, for those on the phone, if they want to write it down, is comments, so that's COMMENTS, @mpwmd.net. So that's comments @mpwmd.net. And I know one person had their hand raised at some point, so I'm hoping we start getting some comments in that I can start reading out. If anyone has prepared a lengthy comment, I will do my best to read through that quickly. I am able to talk very quickly, if you haven't noticed, so I'll try to do that, but we don't want to go past about a 3-minute mark just for fairness to other people. But for those just typing it in, right now, it probably won't be a problem, I'm guessing. I haven't seen any come in yet, but we will hang tight and wait for those. Okay. So the first one is from JAC. Did you evaluate the qualifications for the third-party operator? How can you simply assume that the third-party operator will operate the system in the same manner as Cal-Am? So that relates to a couple of the alternatives we looked at. So that's something we'll look at and respond to in the final EIR. Okay, here's another one. This is from Rudy Fisher. It says, Megan and Dave, thanks for a very comprehensive EIR. And this shows just how complex an undertaking this is. So I am glad Dave and Dave are there to get us through that process. Thank you for that comment.
Great comment.
As we wait for others, if anyone's still kind of new to Zoom or having trouble finding the chat, for me, when I go to the top of my screen, some of the options for Zoom pop up, and there's those 3 dots on the right. And if you click that, you'll have a drop down and you can click on the chat function. I think there's other ways to.
Yeah, and I noticed Mark Kelly and Paul, I'm assuming Bruno, have their hands up.
Yeah, I just saw that.
So again, our form of receiving comment is through the chat function, which is under the 3 dots in the More bar on your device. And then certainly via email or mail.
Mm-hmm. And again, we will be responding to everything in writing. Okay, so I just got another one, which is from MaryAnn Carbone. It says, since the district is openly opposing the Cal-Am desal plant, what guarantees does Sand City have that the district will not just abandon the desal plant? Thank you for that comment as well. We will respond to that in EIR. Okay, and there's a comment from George Riley. What are the implications of not annexing, sorry, another one just popped in. What are the implications of not annexing the 50 properties outside the boundary? So that's a good question as well. I think that gets into the alternatives we talked about. So I believe it was alternative 2 and 4 look at the implications of just that.
Yeah, and I think the likely method of service was discussed in the narrative.
Yeah. And then I just got a question from Tammy Jennings. Is this meeting being recorded for viewing later? And yes, thank you for bringing that up. I did mean to mention that it is being recorded. It will be put on the district's website. This is also being live streamed on public access. and being replayed later, although I don't know the date offhand of when it'll be restreamed or whatever on public access. So, but yeah, that'll be put on the district's website in the next couple of days.
Yeah, I think it'll be on the Monday the 13th.
Okay.
On AMP.
Yes. And then I just got a comment from Paul's iPad. It says Measure J gave the water management district the authority to, there's a few typos, I'm trying to figure out what this, the authority to own all water systems within their boundary, and now they proposed to acquire assets outside the boundaries. Is that contrary to the direction from the voters? And then there's a follow-up that he corrected the typo. So thank you for that. So again, this is getting to one of the alternatives where we look at assets outside of the boundary of the district. So we do look at that in the alternatives chapter. And then I have one from, I'm sure I didn't skip one from Susan. Do you cost out alternative 3 versus the project? Is there any savings in using an outside contractor? And do you explain in the EIR why number 3 is environmentally superior only as one of the alternative choices? So lots of interest in the alternatives, which is good. We'll respond to that. I do just want to note that, you know, CEQA is expressly not, doesn't deal with economics or costs of things. And so we don't get into that expressly in the EIR itself. But we do have an explanation in the alternatives chapter about why we selected environmentally. Alternative 3 is environmentally superior. And as I mentioned in the summary, it really gets to the objectives of the project rather than the true, you know, environmental benefits, since they were ultimately equivalent.
Yeah, and I think it's important. That's a very good distinction, Megan, that it's not an economic document, it's an environmental document. However, in the in the economic analysis, it was highlighted as an alternative, and it was not economically superior to integrated operations, which would be, in effect, the alternative where you hire all of the current employees, save, you know, 3 or 4.
And then there's another comment from MaryAnn Carbone. Operating a desal plant is a complex task. The EIR does not address who is being considered to operate the desal plant, for example. Will they be required to have desal experience with desalination plants and beach intake wells? All good questions.
Right, and that won't get addressed in the final EIR because it's not really an environmental issue. But qualifications and certifications are an issue, and we will have operations planning documents available towards the end of this phase of the process that will better enumerate that.
And there's a follow-up about that from the same commenter. For the selection of an operator of the desal plant, what input will Sand City have in that process?
Okay.
Hang tight a little bit to see if more come in. But again, even if you are providing comments right now, which we appreciate, you know, if you go back and think about it more, have a chance to review portions of the EIR. I doubt many people are going to read it cover to cover, although that's always the hope. You know, you can think about your comments, send them in by email or hard copy later, and we have until August 3rd for that. So just under a month left to go. Okay, and then we have one from John, which I don't have a last name. It says, is this a capital project construction project of the water supply project EIR or an equity purchase?
Right, and that was clarified early on. The project is not defined by a physical construction project. In an abundance of caution, because of the situation with the potential of severing the satellite systems from the main system and having duplication in operations, you know, fleet management, number of employees, what have you, that from that standpoint, it warranted an examination of the potential environmental impacts. in many of these types of transactions where it's simply a change in ownership, it is not a project under CEQA.
Let me see if any more comments come in here. I did mention, based on one of the questions that came up, that the recording of this will be posted to the website. We will also be posting the actual PowerPoint slides as well, so if you want to review those later. And of course, the EIR itself is up there.
Well, I think we might be nearing the end.
It looks like it. I'm going to put out a call for last comments. If anyone wants to provide a comment right now, please send those in. Otherwise, yeah, we'll probably close it out here in a few minutes. Okay, I just got one. This is from Mark Kelly. It says, please be sure to carefully look at Prop 18. It seems very clear that tiered rates are not allowed. New state law on consumption requirements are, I believe, subject to a task force review, which includes ACWA. Tiered rates seem key to conservation.
Yep, we're on that one.
Thanks for that comment. Any other final comments? What do you think, Dave? Should we?
I think we can wrap it up.
Okay.
We appreciate everybody making their personal time available for this.
I got one more.
Mentioned. We got one more.
Can you please provide a link to the draft EIR? So that is on the district's website, but if you need to hang tight as Dave
yeah, the easiest thing is the easiest thing is to go to our website and look for one of the 4 little colored buttons near the very top of the homepage. And there's one that links you to all the Measure J and EIR related materials.
Yeah.
And again, I want to, oh, is there another one? I was just going to say thanks to everybody for making time for this very complex process.
Yeah, definitely. We appreciate it. And so real quickly, the district website is mpwmd.net. And then as Dave mentioned, there's these bars up top. Click on the green one, Measure J, and Acquisition EIR, and you'll find the link. And also, if you got the direct email with information for this meeting, it should be in there as well. And a note on that, if you're not getting the direct emails, but you want to be added to the mailing list, please send a comment to the email address we mentioned. And it's up on the screen if you have that. If not, again, it's comments@mpwmd.net. And we can add you to the mailing list for any future announcements. I think I might have one more comment. Okay. Yeah, and we can also add the link to the EIR in the PowerPoint slides that we post on the website as well.
Well, all right, Megan, thank you for your leadership on this call and the new paradigm of remote meetings. I know it's difficult for the participants not to always have their voices heard, but we will certainly give all the scrutiny we can to your written comments and be as responsive as possible.
Definitely. Yeah, and thank you for taking the time, and we look forward to further comments. And with that, I don't see any other comments, so I think we are good.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you, Rincon.